I didn't lose my family in one moment. I lost them quietly on paper, behind closed doors with signatures I never saw. One day I was a daughter. The next I was locked out. Not just from a house, but from a lifetime of memories, from accounts I didn't know existed, from decisions already made without my name on them. My sister said everything was settled. She said there was nothing left to discuss. She said the law was on her side. So I stayed silent. I watched the doors close. I listened as my life was summarized in a few cold sentences. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I didn't demand answers. I sat there, hands folded, heart pounding, while everyone assumed the story was over, until the attorney stopped reading. He looked up, he adjusted his glasses, and he asked one simple question. The room went quiet. In that silence, everything my sister built on secrets began to crack. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives with a pause. Before we continue, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. And if stories about quiet endurance and delayed justice speak to you, consider subscribing. You're not alone here. When I look back now, the unfairness didn't start with money. It started long before anyone talked about wills, accounts, or property deeds. It started when we were kids, in small moments that felt harmless at the time. Moments everyone brushed off as just how things are. My sister Rachel was 2 years older than me. In our family, that small difference might as well have been a lifetime. From the beginning, she was described as confident, sharp, and destined for something big. I was the quiet one, the easy child, the one who didn't cause trouble and didn't need much attention. At least that's how it was framed. When Rachel spoke, adults listened. When I spoke, they smiled politely and moved on. If Rachel wanted something, there was a discussion. If I wanted something, there was a reminder about being grateful for what I already had. No one ever said I mattered less. They didn't have to. It was shown to me every day in the choices they made. At family gatherings, relatives asked Rachel about her grades, her plans, her future career. When they turned to me, it was usually to comment on how sweet or well-behaved I was, as if my greatest achievement was not taking up space. I learned early that pushing back only made things worse. When we were teenagers, the pattern became clearer. Rachel got a newer car because she needed it more. She was more social, more active, more visible. I drove an old one that stalled at red lights because I didn't complain. When she argued with our parents, they called it passion. When I disagreed, they called it attitude. So I stopped disagreeing. At school, I worked hard. Not because anyone expected it of me, but because it was the one thing I could control. I kept my head down, earned solid grades, and never asked for praise. Rachel, meanwhile, struggled more academically, but was always supported, encouraged, and reassured that grades weren't everything. For me, grades were assumed. They were the minimum. By the time we reached adulthood, our roles were set. Rachel stayed close to home. She went to a local college, changed majors twice, and eventually dropped out. None of that was ever held against her. She was finding herself. She helped our parents with errands, paperwork, and appointments. She positioned herself as indispensable. I left. I moved states away for college. I worked part-time jobs, paid my own rent, and learned how to be alone. I didn't ask my parents for help because I didn't want to hear the unspoken comparison, "Rachel needs us more than you do." And in truth, I had learned to need less. Phone calls home became shorter. Updates about family matters were vague. Rachel was always handling things. If I asked questions, I was told not to worry. Everything was under control. That phrase would come back to haunt me. Our parents started aging faster than I expected. First, it was small things, forgetting appointments, misplacing documents, repeating stories. Rachel stepped in naturally. She drove them to the bank. She sat with them during meetings. She filled out forms to make it easier. When I visited, I noticed how often she spoke for them, how often she redirected conversations when I asked direct questions. If I pressed, she'd smile and say, "Don't stress them out. I've got it." And I believed her. Part of me wanted to believe that my sister, for all her flaws, would never cross certain lines. After all, this was family. Who would take advantage of their own parents? Looking back, I realize how naive that sounds. Still, I stayed quiet. I didn't challenge her authority. I didn't demand transparency. I told myself that my parents trusted her, and that should be enough. I told myself that being the calm one meant letting go of control. But calm slowly turned into distance. I missed meetings because I wasn't invited. I found out about decisions after they were made. When I asked about legal documents, powers of attorney, estate plans, I was told they were just formalities. Rachel said my parents didn't want to overwhelm me with details. That should have been my first real warning. Instead, I accepted it, because accepting things had always been easier than fighting them. And because deep down I had been trained my whole life to believe that my role was to adapt, not to question. The emotional cost of that silence didn't hit me all at once. It settled slowly, like a weight I didn't realize I was carrying. Each time I hung up the phone feeling excluded. Each time I visited and felt like a guest in my own family. Each time my sister made decisions that affected all of us, and no one asked for my input. I told myself I was being mature, that I was above sibling rivalry, that staying out of conflict made me stronger. But there's a difference between strength and erasure. By the time our parents' health declined seriously, Rachel was deeply embedded in every aspect of their lives. She had access, she had proximity, and more importantly, she had control over information. I was the one who lived far away, the one who trusted too much, the one who believed that silence would protect me. I didn't realize yet that silence doesn't protect you when someone else is speaking for you, and I had no idea how expensive that silence was about to become. By the time I reached my late 20s, the distance between my sister's life and mine was no longer just physical. It was structural. She was embedded in my parents' daily existence while I had built a life that functioned without them. What looked like independence on my side slowly became invisibility. I graduated college with a solid GPA and no debt from my parents. That wasn't an accident. I worked evenings, weekends, summers, any contract that paid and didn't ask questions. I learned how to budget down to the dollar, how to negotiate salaries, how to move apartments with everything I owned in the trunk of my car. I took pride in not needing help. Rachel took pride in being needed. She stayed close to home. She knew which pharmacy my mom preferred, which neighbor kept a spare key, which bank teller greeted my dad by name. When my parents mentioned paperwork, insurance, or finances, her name came up automatically. Rachel's handling that. It was said with relief, as if responsibility had finally found a permanent home. When my parents spoke about me, it was different. She's busy. She's independent. She doesn't need us. Those words sounded complimentary, but they came with consequences. The less I needed, the less I was consulted. Phone calls turned into check-ins instead of conversations. Visits felt scheduled around Rachel's availability. If I asked detailed questions about finances, legal documents, or long-term plans, the answers were always vague. We'll talk about it later. It's nothing urgent. Rachel already took care of that. At first, I accepted it. I didn't want to micromanage from another state. I didn't want to undermine my sister's efforts. I told myself that trust was part of being an adult child, but trust without transparency has a cost. Over time, Rachel's role shifted from helper to intermediary. Messages passed through her. Updates were filtered. When I spoke to my parents, I could hear her in the background, prompting them, correcting details, steering the conversation away from anything complicated. It was subtle, almost polite. The first moment that truly unsettled me came during a short visit home. My dad asked me to help him find a document in his office. While flipping through drawers, I noticed a thick folder labeled Estate and Assets. Before I could say anything, Rachel appeared in the doorway. "Oh, that's old," she said quickly. "We updated all that." Her tone wasn't defensive. It was final. Later that night, I asked my mom about it. She paused longer than usual before answering. "Rachel explained everything to us," she said. "It's simpler this way." Simpler for whom I wondered. Still, I didn't push. I had spent my entire life learning that pushing only made me seem difficult. I didn't want to be the daughter who caused stress, especially as my parents' health became more fragile. As the years passed, signs of decline became harder to ignore. My dad forgot appointments. My mom mixed up dates and names. Rachel framed it as normal, aging, nothing to worry about. She increased her involvement, attending appointments alone, managing medications, handling calls. She also began handling signatures. She told me our parents had given her permission to sign on their behalf to avoid confusion. She said it casually as if it were an obvious solution. When I asked if I should be included in those decisions, she laughed softly. "You live so far away. It would just slow things down." I told myself she was right. That was the lie I clung to. I started noticing how rarely my parents contacted me directly about important matters. News about their health, their finances, their plans came secondhand, usually days later. When I asked why they hadn't called, Rachel said she didn't want to bother me. What she was really doing was controlling the flow of information. The longer this went on, the more uneasy I felt. I began saving emails. I paid attention to phrasing to timelines that didn't quite line up, but I still didn't confront her. Confrontation felt like a betrayal of the role I had always played, the reasonable one, the calm one, the one who didn't make waves. I believed fairness would assert itself eventually, that when it mattered, my parents' intentions would be clear, that the law would naturally reflect what felt morally obvious. I didn't understand yet how easily morality disappears when it isn't documented. One evening, Rachel sent me an email outlining several financial adjustments she had made with Mom and Dad's approval. It included account changes, beneficiary updates, and new authorizations. My name appeared nowhere. I replied, asking why. Her response was short and carefully worded. They didn't want to complicate things. That sentence landed heavier than she probably intended. Because in that moment, I realized I had already been simplified out of the picture. I thought about calling a lawyer. I thought about demanding copies of documents. But every scenario ended the same way in my mind: accusations, family meetings, being told I was overreacting or greedy. So I stayed silent. What I didn't know then was that silence doesn't slow down someone who's moving with intention. It only clears the path. By the time I understood that Rachel wasn't just assisting my parents, she was representing them. And I had no proof where their consent ended and her decisions began. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was at work. I remember because Tuesdays were usually quiet, predictable. That day wasn't. It was Rachel's number on my phone. Not my mom's, not my dad's, hers. Her voice was controlled, almost rehearsed. She said there had been an emergency. Dad had collapsed at home. The ambulance was already gone. Mom was with him. She said I didn't need to rush yet. They were handling it. I hung up and stared at my screen for a long time, trying to understand how something so serious could be delivered so calmly. I booked the earliest flight I could find anyway. By the time I arrived at the hospital, the worst had already happened. My father was gone. There are moments that fracture time, and that was one of them. Everything after that felt muted, distant, as if I were moving through thick glass. I remember the smell of disinfectant, the sound of monitors, the way Rachel stood near the bed speaking softly to doctors while I hovered just outside the circle. No one asked me what I needed. The days that followed blurred together. Funeral arrangements, condolences, paperwork. Rachel took charge immediately. She spoke to funeral directors, coordinated schedules, answered calls. People praised her for being strong, for holding everything together. I stood beside her, silent, numb. When relatives asked questions about plans, finances, or next steps, Rachel answered with confidence. When they turned to me, it was with pity. "You must be so overwhelmed," they said. I nodded because it was easier than explaining that I didn't even know what I was supposed to be overwhelmed about. After the funeral, things didn't slow down. They accelerated. Rachel stayed at my parents' house. She said Mom couldn't be alone. That made sense. I offered to stay longer, but Rachel insisted I should go back to work. "You've already taken so much time off," she said gently. "I've got things covered here." I left feeling guilty for wanting to stay. A few weeks later, my mother's health declined rapidly. Grief hollowed her out. She stopped eating properly. She forgot to take medication. Rachel was with her constantly. Phone calls from my mom became rare, short, unfocused. Then, one night, I got another call from Rachel. Mom had passed in her sleep. I flew home again, this time with a heavier understanding of finality. There were no parents left to ask questions, no one left to clarify intentions or explain decisions, just paperwork. And Rachel. The second funeral was quieter, smaller. People spoke in hushed voices about how hard this must be for Rachel, losing both parents so close together. They praised her devotion, her sacrifice. No one mentioned me. After everything was over, after the last relative left town and the casseroles stopped arriving, I assumed there would be a pause. Time to grieve, time to process, time to talk. Instead, Rachel shifted into efficiency mode. She told me we would meet soon to go over logistics. That phrase sounded harmless enough. When I asked what it meant, she said it was about settling the estate, closing accounts, transferring property. I expected to be included. The meeting never happened. Instead, I received an email. It was short, polite, final. Rachel wrote that everything had been settled according to our parents' wishes. The house was being transferred. Accounts were already restructured. There was nothing left to decide. At the bottom, she added a sentence that changed everything. You'll need to make arrangements for somewhere else to stay when you're in town. I read it 3 times, certain I was misunderstanding something. I called her immediately. She didn't answer. When she finally did, her tone was firm. She explained that the house now belonged to her, that she needed space, that it wouldn't be appropriate for me to come and go. I asked her where I fit into all of this. She paused, then said, "This is what Mom and Dad wanted." There was no anger in her voice, no guilt, just certainty. I asked to see the will. She said there was no need. That was the moment grief turned into something else. Not rage, not even sadness, disbelief. I realized how completely the ground had shifted beneath me. In a matter of weeks, I had lost my parents and my place in the family. I was no longer a daughter or a sister in any meaningful way. I was an inconvenience. When I arrived in town again a month later to collect some personal items, I found the locks had been changed. My key didn't work. I stood on the porch of the house I grew up in, holding a suitcase, staring at a door that no longer recognized me. I knocked. No answer. I called Rachel, straight to voicemail. A neighbor came out and asked if I needed help. I smiled and said no. I drove away and cried in my car instead. That night alone in a hotel room, I replayed everything in my head. Every ignored question, every vague answer, every moment I chose silence over discomfort. I understood then that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't grief-fueled confusion. It was a plan that had been unfolding quietly, legally, efficiently, and I had been absent from it by design. For the first time, I didn't tell myself to stay calm. I didn't tell myself to be understanding. I opened my laptop and started searching for attorneys, not to fight my sister, but to understand what had been done in my parents' names. Because if Rachel was right, if this was truly what they wanted, then the truth would support her, and if she was wrong, then silence was no longer an option. The night I finally accepted that silence had cost me too much, I didn't feel brave. I felt exhausted. I was sitting on the edge of a hotel bed, staring at my phone, scrolling through my call history, and realizing how many times I had almost reached out for help and hadn't. The first attorney I contacted was polite but distant. He listened to my story like he'd heard it 100 times before. When I finished, he explained that estate disputes between siblings were common, emotionally draining, and often unwinnable if documents were in place. He didn't say it directly, but the message was clear: accept what happened and move on. I hung up, feeling dismissed. The second attorney was more practical. She asked for copies of the will powers of attorney and trust documents. When I told her I didn't have them, there was a pause. Then she said she couldn't advise me without seeing paperwork. It wasn't unkind, just procedural. The third attorney asked me to slow down. He didn't interrupt. He didn't jump to conclusions. When I finished speaking, he said something that shifted the way I understood everything. Let's separate emotion from evidence. His name was Daniel Collins. He explained that the law didn't evaluate family dynamics or intentions the way people did. It evaluated process, capacity, timing, consent, authority. If those elements were sound, motives didn't matter. If they weren't, everything else fell apart. For the first time, I wasn't being told how unfair the situation was. I was being shown how it could be examined. Daniel asked me to reconstruct a timeline not based on feelings but on verifiable events. Hospitalizations, doctor visits, document dates, travel records, emails, messages, anything that showed when decisions were made and who was present. As I started pulling things together, a pattern emerged that I hadn't noticed before. Critical documents were signed during periods of obvious medical instability. Updates to accounts coincided with hospital stays. Changes that were framed as routine clustered tightly around moments when my parents were least capable of questioning them. None of that proved anything on its own, but it raised questions. When Daniel formally requested copies of estate documents from Rachel, the response came through her attorney. It was brief and firm. The estate, they said, had been lawfully settled. There was no obligation to provide additional information. Daniel expected that. He filed a petition. That was the first official action taken in my name, and it felt heavier than I expected. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't accusatory. It simply asked the court to review whether the process had been proper. Rachel called me the same day she received notice. Her voice was sharp, stripped of the calm authority she'd always used with me. She asked why I was doing this. She said I was disrespecting our parents. She said I was creating stress for no reason. I told her I needed clarity. She told me clarity was a luxury I didn't deserve anymore. After that, communication stopped completely. Everything went through attorneys. Legal language replaced family language. Deadlines replaced conversations. I attended my first hearing quietly. I sat behind Daniel and listened as Rachel's attorney described her as a devoted daughter who sacrificed years of her life caring for our parents while I chose distance. The narrative was clean, sympathetic, easy to understand. I didn't correct it, because it wasn't the point. Daniel focused on dates, on signatures, on whether independent counsel had been present, on whether medical evaluations aligned with the timing of key documents. Rachel answered questions eagerly. She filled in details before they were requested. She explained decisions. She justified actions. The judge listened. Outside the courtroom, extended family stopped responding to my messages. Some sent brief notes expressing disappointment. Others said nothing at all. I was being quietly erased again, this time socially. It hurt. But it also confirmed something Daniel had warned me about when the truth is, inconvenient people prefer a simpler story. As months passed, the estate was partially frozen pending review. Rachel complained publicly that I was preventing her from moving on. She framed the legal process as harassment. Friends and relatives rallied around her. I stayed silent. Daniel filed a request for a full accounting, every transaction, every transfer, every authorization. It was a standard legal step, but it changed everything. Suddenly, Rachel's side asked for extensions. Documents were submitted late. Explanations grew technical and defensive. The tone shifted from certainty to urgency. Daniel remained steady. He explained to me that this was often the moment when things became clear, not because someone confessed, but because complexity increased, where simplicity should have existed. A final hearing was scheduled to address unresolved discrepancies. It would be open to the public. I didn't know what the outcome would be. I didn't know whether the court would rule in my favor or confirm everything Rachel had done. But for the first time since my parents died, I felt grounded. Not because I was fighting, but because the truth, whatever it was about to be examined in a place where silence and control no longer worked, and I would be there not to argue or accuse, just to let the process speak. The weeks leading up to the next hearing were the quietest I had experienced since everything began. Not quiet in the sense of peace, but in the sense of suspension, like standing in a room where the air itself was waiting. Daniel warned me that this phase would feel slow. Court timelines always did. But beneath that slowness, things were moving. Requests were being processed. Records were being pulled. Institutions were being compelled to respond. And for the first time, Rachel was no longer in control of what information existed. Daniel asked me not to contact my sister. Not because it would weaken the case, but because it would weaken me. "You've already said everything you need to say," he told me. "Now let the documents talk." So, I stayed quiet. I focused on my job. I answered emails. I attended meetings. From the outside, my life looked normal. Inside, everything felt provisional. I didn't know where I would be living long term. I didn't know whether I'd be able to return to my childhood home, even briefly, to collect what little remained of my parents' presence in my life. But I knew one thing: the story I had been told no longer made sense. Daniel called one afternoon with an update. His voice was calm but deliberate. Several financial institutions had responded to the court's request. Account access logs showed patterns: frequent activity by Rachel during periods when my parents were hospitalized or under medical supervision. Authorizations had been added, removed, and re-added within short spans of time. None of it was dramatic, but none of it was clean. He explained that these patterns didn't automatically mean fraud. They meant scrutiny. And scrutiny was something Rachel had never faced. The next hearing wasn't meant to be confrontational. It was procedural. A review of submitted records, clarifications, the kind of hearing people rarely paid attention to unless something unexpected happened. Still, the courtroom was fuller than I anticipated. Extended family members sat on one side, quiet but watchful. Rachel sat confidently beside her attorney, dressed professionally, posture straight. She didn't look at me. I sat behind Daniel, hands folded, eyes forward. The judge began by summarizing the case in neutral language. An estate, 2 beneficiaries. Questions regarding authority and timing. Nothing accusatory, nothing emotional. Then Daniel stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make statements about fairness or betrayal. He asked for clarification on specific dates. He referenced hospital records. He asked whether independent counsel had been present when certain documents were executed. Rachel's attorney answered carefully. Rachel, however, leaned forward and added details that weren't requested. She explained why certain decisions were necessary, why speed mattered, why involving me would have complicated things. She spoke as if she were still managing a family situation, not responding to legal review. The judge listened without interruption. When it was Daniel's turn again, he did something subtle. He asked a question that didn't accuse Rachel of wrongdoing, but reframed her role. "Were you acting as a caregiver," he asked, "or as a legal representative at that time?" Rachel answered immediately. "Both." The courtroom felt different after that word landed, because both came with obligations. The judge requested additional documentation. Not new evidence, just confirmation. Proof of capacity assessments. Records showing that my parents understood the scope of what they were signing. Proof that Rachel had not influenced decisions beyond her authority. Rachel's attorney asked for time. The judge granted it. Outside the courtroom, Rachel finally looked at me. Her expression wasn't anger. It was something closer to disbelief, as if she couldn't understand how this had escalated without me raising my voice even once. Daniel told me later that this was often the most destabilizing part for people like her. They expected confrontation. They were prepared for emotional resistance. What they weren't prepared for was being questioned by systems they couldn't charm or intimidate. Over the next month, more records came in. Emails from financial institutions that contradicted Rachel's timeline. Medical notes that documented cognitive impairment on days when signatures were obtained. A witness statement from a bank employee who remembered Rachel answering questions on my father's behalf. Each piece on its own was small. Together they formed something undeniable. Rachel's attorney shifted strategy. The narrative changed from certainty to complexity. They argued that decisions had been made in good faith, that stress and grief blurred timelines, that no one could expect perfection in circumstances like these. Daniel didn't argue against that. He simply asked whether good faith replaced proper process. The judge ordered a temporary freeze on remaining assets pending full review. Rachel reacted sharply. She stood up, objected, tried to explain. The judge asked her to sit down. That moment stayed with me longer than anything else. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was the first time someone in authority had told my sister to stop speaking. After that hearing, I felt a strange mix of relief and grief. Relief that my concerns were finally being taken seriously. Grief that it had taken this much formality to be heard. Daniel cautioned me not to celebrate. "We're not at the end," he said. "We're just past the point where control shifts." The final review hearing was scheduled several weeks later. It would involve testimony, cross-referencing, public record. Rachel would have to answer questions she couldn't redirect. In the days leading up to it, I didn't feel nervous. I felt hollowed out, as if everything emotional had already been spent and only resolve remained. I didn't rehearse statements. I didn't prepare speeches. Daniel told me I likely wouldn't need to speak much at all. "The strongest position," he said, "is the one that doesn't need defending." When the day came, I walked into the courthouse alone. I didn't sit with family. I didn't seek eye contact. I took my seat and waited. Because whatever happened next would no longer be shaped by who spoke the loudest. It would be shaped by what could be proven. The morning of the final review hearing arrived without drama. No thunder, no phone calls, no last-minute revelations. Just a gray sky and the steady rhythm of traffic outside the courthouse. I arrived early not because I was eager, but because waiting somewhere else felt unbearable. Inside the courtroom looked smaller than I remembered. Familiar faces were already there: Rachel's attorney, a few extended relatives, a couple of people I recognized from earlier hearings. Rachel sat in the same place she always did, posture perfect, hands folded, expression composed. She looked like someone who expected closure. Daniel joined me quietly. He didn't ask how I was feeling. He didn't need to. He reviewed a few notes, then closed the folder in front of him and said, "Today is about precision." When the judge entered, the room stood. We sat again and the proceedings began. The judge summarized where things stood. There were unresolved questions regarding authority, timing, and capacity. The court would hear clarifying testimony and review remaining documentation before determining whether the estate had been administered properly. It was procedural, calm, almost understated. Rachel's attorney went first. He spoke about context, about grief, about urgency. He emphasized that Rachel had acted out of love and responsibility, stepping in when no one else was present. He framed her actions as necessary responses to difficult circumstances. There was no accusation in his tone, just explanation. Rachel nodded occasionally as if confirming the story. Then Daniel stood. He didn't challenge the idea that Rachel had cared for our parents. He didn't question her presence or her involvement. Instead, he narrowed the focus. Caregiving, he said, and legal authority are not the same thing. He walked through dates, not emotionally, chronologically, hospital admissions, medication changes, medical notes documenting confusion, document execution dates, bank access logs. He didn't accuse Rachel of malice. He asked whether the process had met the legal standard required when someone holds power over another person's decisions. The judge listened carefully. Rachel was then called to answer questions. She stood confidently. Her voice was steady at first. She described how overwhelmed she had been, how much responsibility she carried, how no one else was there to help. She spoke as if she were still explaining things to family members who needed reassurance. Daniel waited. Then he asked her about a specific document, a power of attorney executed shortly before my father's hospitalization. He asked who was present. She answered. He asked whether independent counsel had advised my father at the time. She hesitated, then said she didn't remember. He asked about another document. A signature dated the same day my mother's medical records noted confusion. Rachel said the timing must be off. That paperwork often lagged behind reality. Daniel nodded. He didn't argue. He asked one more question. If the timing was off, he said, why does the notary record match the medical admission time exactly? The room went quiet. Rachel looked toward her attorney. He didn't interrupt. She tried to explain. She said stress affected memory, that she couldn't be expected to recall every detail years later. Daniel thanked her and sat down. The judge requested the notary log. It was already in evidence. As the judge reviewed it, the atmosphere in the room shifted. It wasn't dramatic. No one gasped. But the certainty Rachel had carried into the room began to dissolve. Rachel's attorney requested a brief recess. The judge denied it. Instead, the judge asked a question directly to Rachel. When your parents signed these documents, the judge said, did they understand that their other child was being excluded? Rachel answered quickly. Yes. The judge followed up. And what documentation exists to support that understanding? Rachel paused. She opened her mouth, closed it, then said, they told me. The judge waited. Rachel added, they trusted me. The judge nodded slowly and turned back to the file. That was the moment I realized something important. Rachel had spent years speaking for my parents, but when asked to show where their voices existed independently of hers, she had nothing concrete to offer. Daniel didn't press further. He let the silence sit. When proceedings resumed, the judge addressed the room. The court was not tasked with evaluating intentions or family loyalty, the judge said. It was tasked with evaluating whether legal safeguards had been followed when one individual assumed control over another's affairs. Based on the evidence presented, there were significant concerns. The judge ordered that the estate administration be deemed incomplete and potentially improper. A neutral third-party administrator would be appointed. Assets would remain frozen until a full redistribution could be determined under court supervision. Rachel reacted immediately. She stood, objected, tried to explain again. The judge asked her to sit down. She didn't. The judge raised their voice for the first time in any hearing I had attended. Sit. Down. Rachel sat. That sound, the chair legs scraping against the floor, felt louder than anything else that day. The ruling wasn't final. There would be additional steps, additional review. But the foundation of Rachel's control had been removed. Outside the courtroom, people avoided my eyes. Some looked confused. Others looked uncomfortable. Rachel didn't speak to me. She left quickly, her attorney close behind. Daniel packed his papers and turned to me. This is where things change, he said. Not because you won, but because control has been replaced with oversight. I didn't feel victorious. I felt emptied out. Later that evening, alone in my hotel room, I replayed the day in my mind. Not the ruling, but the questions. The way authority shifted when answers stopped coming easily. The way certainty collapsed under specificity. I thought about all the years I stayed quiet because I didn't want to cause conflict. All the moments I believed silence was the same as strength. That day taught me something different. Silence can protect the truth, but only when someone is finally willing to ask the right questions. And the most powerful questions are often the simplest ones. After the ruling, nothing ended, the way people expect endings to happen. There was no final speech, no public apology, no dramatic exit. What followed instead was a long, uncomfortable period where certainty disappeared and everyone had to live inside questions. The court appointed a neutral estate administrator within days. His role was clear: review everything from the beginning and untangle what had been merged too quickly, too quietly. For the first time since my parents passed, decisions were no longer filtered through Rachel. That alone changed the air around everything. Rachel responded by retreating. She stopped posting. She stopped calling relatives. The confidence she once carried openly was replaced with controlled silence. When she did speak, usually through her attorney, her language was careful, defensive, restrained. I noticed something else too. People who had been loud in their support of her became quieter. No one apologized to me, but no one accused me anymore either. The story had lost its clean edges. The administrator, Mr. Hargreave, contacted me directly. He asked for patience and cooperation. He explained that his job wasn't to assign blame, but to reconstruct an accurate picture of my parents' intentions based on verifiable evidence. He requested interviews. My first meeting with him was in a plain office with no personal touches. He asked about my relationship with my parents, not emotionally, but practically. How often we spoke, what we discussed, whether they had ever expressed specific wishes regarding their estate. I answered honestly. They had talked about fairness, about wanting both of us to be okay. They had never mentioned excluding anyone. They had never framed their planning as secretive or urgent. Mr. Hargreave took notes. He didn't react. Then he asked about Rachel. I described her involvement factually: the proximity, the control over information, the timing of changes. I didn't speculate about motives. He nodded. The administrator then reviewed records that hadn't been part of earlier hearings: insurance policies, retirement accounts, older drafts of estate documents, and something unexpected emerged. Years before my parents' health declined, they had created a preliminary estate plan. It was simple, balanced. It named both of us equally. There were no conditions, no exclusions. That plan had never been formally revoked. Instead, it had been overwritten piecemeal, account by account, authorization by authorization, without a single comprehensive update. That mattered, because it suggested that what Rachel presented as a unified decision was actually a series of fragmented changes made under different circumstances. Mr. Hargreave scheduled a follow-up meeting, this time including Rachel. Sitting across from her without the emotional distance of a courtroom felt stranger than I expected. She avoided eye contact. When she spoke, her words were clipped, defensive. She insisted our parents had trusted her judgment, that they didn't want complications, that she was only doing what they asked. The administrator asked her for documentation of those requests. She provided emails, most of which were written by her, notes undated, unsigned, statements from friends who believed my parents wanted things handled simply. None of it established independent consent. The administrator didn't argue. He explained that when one person holds both practical and legal power, the burden of proof shifts. Good intentions are not assumed, they are demonstrated. Rachel grew visibly frustrated. She asked whether her years of caregiving meant nothing. Mr. Hargreave answered calmly. Caregiving matters, but it doesn't replace legal safeguards. That sentence stayed with me. Over the following weeks, the administrator compiled a report. It included timelines, inconsistencies, and conclusions drawn strictly from documentation. It didn't accuse Rachel of theft or fraud. It did conclude that the estate had not been administered in accordance with legal standards designed to protect vulnerable individuals. The recommendation was clear. The estate should be redistributed based on the last uncontested plan, with adjustments for assets added later under court supervision. Rachel objected. She filed motions. She requested reconsideration. Each request delayed the process, but it didn't change the findings. The court denied her motions one by one. During this time, I stayed mostly invisible. I didn't speak to the press. I didn't post online. I didn't confront family members who suddenly wanted to check in. I had learned that letting systems do their work was more effective than trying to manage perception. When the court scheduled the final redistribution hearing, it was listed as a formality, but the room was full again. People wanted to see how it ended. The judge summarized the administrator's findings. They acknowledged Rachel's caregiving. They also acknowledged the imbalance of power and the absence of proper safeguards. Then, they approved the redistribution. Assets were to be divided equally. The house would be sold, proceeds split. Accounts would be adjusted retroactively. Rachel would be required to return assets transferred without proper authority. The judge's tone was firm, not punitive. This wasn't a punishment. It was a correction. Rachel didn't speak after that. She didn't look at me. She gathered her things and left without saying goodbye. I sat there stunned by how quiet justice sounded. There was no applause, no relief that washed over me all at once. Just a deep, steady sense that something heavy had finally been set down. Outside the courthouse, Daniel asked me how I felt. I thought about it for a moment. I feel like I can breathe, I said. That was the truth. Not because I had won something, but because what had been taken quietly had been returned openly. And for the first time since my parents died, I wasn't standing outside the story of my own life. The weeks after the redistribution ruling were not the relief I had imagined during all those months of waiting. Instead of closure, there was adjustment. Instead of celebration, there was a slow, deliberate reckoning with money, with memory, and with the reality that justice once delivered still leaves behind consequences no court can organize. The house was the first thing that had to be addressed. My parents' home had always been the emotional center of our family. It was where holidays happened, where arguments ended, where everything eventually circled back to. Now it was an asset on a list scheduled to be sold. The administrator coordinated access so we could retrieve personal belongings before listing it. Rachel chose not to come when I did. Walking through the house alone felt like entering a space that remembered me better than the people in it ever had. Nothing had changed physically, yet everything felt different. The furniture was the same. The photos were still on the walls. But the sense of ownership of belonging had been stripped away long before the locks were changed. I moved carefully room by room, deciding what to take and what to leave. Not based on value, but on weight. Some things were too heavy to carry. Others surprisingly weren't. In my parents' bedroom, I found a small notebook tucked into a drawer. It wasn't a journal, just a list, appointments, reminders, notes written in my mother's handwriting. Near the back, there was a line that stopped me cold. Make sure both girls are taken care of. There was no date. I didn't show it to anyone. I didn't need to. The sale of the house took longer than expected. The market wasn't ideal, and Rachel's attorney raised objections at every step. But the court held firm. When the house finally sold, the proceeds were split evenly, exactly as the ruling specified. Seeing the funds deposited into my account didn't feel triumphant. It felt surreal. For so long, money had been the symbol of what I'd lost. Now that it was there, it felt like the least important part of what had been returned. Rachel complied with the court's orders, but not gracefully. Assets were returned late. Paperwork was submitted with corrections. Every step felt like resistance wrapped in obligation. We didn't speak. I heard through family members that she was angry, that she felt humiliated, that she believed the court had misunderstood her intentions. Some people said she was struggling financially now. Others said she was preparing to appeal, though no appeal ever came. I didn't ask questions. Because I was finally learning the difference between responsibility and guilt. The administrator concluded his role with a final report. It summarized actions taken, assets distributed, and compliance confirmed. It also included a quiet recommendation that both parties seek independent counseling to process the emotional impact of prolonged estate conflict. The court accepted the report, and just like that, the case was closed. What remained was everything the case couldn't touch. Friends asked me if I felt vindicated, if I felt like I'd won. I struggled to answer because the language didn't fit. Winning implies competition. This hadn't been a contest. It had been a correction of something that went wrong when no one was watching. There were nights I lay awake replaying moments from years earlier. Conversations I could have pushed harder on. Questions I could have asked sooner. Silence I mistook for peace. I had to learn to let that go. Because regret has a way of pretending it's useful, when really it just keeps you anchored to a version of the past that can't respond anymore. The hardest adjustment wasn't financial or logistical. It was relational. Rachel and I existed in a strange, undefined space. We weren't in conflict, but we weren't in contact. Family gatherings stopped including both of us at the same time. Invitations were cautious, filtered, diplomatic. I wasn't angry about that. Some relationships don't end with explosions. They end with recognition. Recognition that something has been broken too thoroughly to pretend otherwise. I began seeing a therapist at Daniel's suggestion, not because I was falling apart, but because I wanted to understand how easily I had accepted being erased. How often I had equated endurance with virtue. In one session, I said something out loud that surprised me. I thought being quiet made me safe. The therapist nodded. It probably did once. That reframing mattered. I started making decisions differently, speaking earlier, asking clearer questions, refusing to accept vague reassurances where specifics were warranted. Not aggressively, just intentionally. The inheritance allowed me practical freedom. I paid off debt. I moved closer to work. I set aside savings that made my life feel less precarious. But the deeper change was internal. For the first time, I trusted my instincts enough to act on them. I didn't reconnect with Rachel. I didn't try to repair something that required only one of us to bend. I let the silence exist without filling it with guilt. Sometimes that's the healthiest form of closure. Months after everything ended, I visited my parents' graves alone. I didn't bring flowers. I didn't rehearse anything to say. I just stood there and let the quiet settle. I told them the truth, that I had been afraid to speak, that I had learned too late that silence can be mistaken for consent, that I hoped they would understand why I had done what I did. There was no response. But there was something else, a sense that I was no longer carrying the story by myself. Justice hadn't given me my family back, it had given me myself, and that I was beginning to understand was enough. Life didn't snap back into place after the case closed. It unfolded slowly, unevenly, as if everything had to relearn its shape. I had expected some dramatic sense of peace, but what I experienced instead was a quieter, more demanding task, rebuilding a life that no longer revolved around waiting to be treated fairly. The first unexpected change was how people interacted with me. Colleagues who had only vaguely known about my situation now asked careful questions. Friends listened differently. Even strangers, when they heard pieces of my story, reacted with a seriousness I wasn't used to. I realized that for years I had minimized my own experiences to make others comfortable. Now, without trying to persuade anyone, I was being heard. That took adjustment. I returned fully to work, not as an escape, but as a grounding force. My job had always been stable, but now it felt purposeful in a way it hadn't before. I negotiated a new contract, something I might have avoided in the past out of fear of seeming demanding. This time I asked for what matched my contributions, and got it. The confidence surprised me. Not because I suddenly felt fearless, but because I trusted my judgment enough to speak. There were moments, though, when the past reached out unexpectedly. A letter from a distant relative, written carefully, expressing regret for choosing sides too quickly. A voicemail from an aunt asking if we could move forward as a family. I didn't respond immediately. I read, listened, and let myself decide without pressure. That too was new. I eventually replied to some. Briefly, kindly, without reopening wounds. I didn't explain myself or justify the legal process. I simply acknowledged their feelings and set boundaries where needed. Most accepted that. A few didn't. Rachel remained absent. I heard updates indirectly: new job, new apartment, a move to another state. The details felt distant, stripped of emotional charge. I wasn't tracking her life anymore. I was living mine. One afternoon, Daniel invited me to coffee. Not as my attorney, but as someone who had watched me navigate months of restraint. He told me something I hadn't considered. Cases like yours, he said, don't usually end this cleanly. I asked what he meant. Most people can't tolerate the waiting, he explained. They lash out. They say too much. They give the other side something to work with. I thought about all the times I'd wanted to scream, to confront, to demand explanations. But you didn't, he said. You let the process work. I didn't feel proud of that. I felt tired. Still, I understood what he was saying. Patience in my case hadn't been passive. It had been strategic, even if I hadn't known it at the time. As the months passed, I found myself revisiting memories of my parents, not the final years clouded by illness and conflict, but earlier ones. Ordinary moments. Driving with my dad to the grocery store, sitting with my mom at the kitchen table while she sorted mail. Those memories felt less painful now, less entangled with resentment. They were just memories again. I stopped replaying alternate outcomes in my head, stopped imagining conversations that could never happen. I accepted that some questions would remain unanswered, not because they weren't valid, but because no one left could answer them honestly. That acceptance was harder than anger. The biggest shift came quietly. One evening, while organizing documents I'd kept throughout the legal process, I realized I no longer needed them close at hand. I scanned what mattered, shredded the rest, and watched the evidence of that chapter disappear into strips of paper. I didn't feel anxious. I felt done. Around that time, I was invited to speak at a small support group, people dealing with family disputes, caregiving stress, and legal uncertainty. I almost declined. Public vulnerability wasn't something I sought. But I went. I didn't tell my whole story. I didn't talk about money or courtrooms. I talked about silence, about how easily it becomes a habit, about how difficult it is to recognize when endurance turns into self-erasure. Afterward, a woman approached me with tears in her eyes. She said she had been staying quiet for years, thinking it made her strong. I told her what I had learned too late: strength isn't measured by how much you endure without speaking. It's measured by knowing when silence stops serving you. That conversation stayed with me. It reframed everything I had been through, not as a tragedy narrowly avoided, but as a lesson painfully learned and finally applied. I began planning for the future with clarity I'd never allowed myself before. Long-term goals, travel, investments, choices made without checking whether they would inconvenience anyone else. For the first time, I wasn't orienting my life around not being a problem. I was orienting it around being present. On the anniversary of the court's final ruling, I didn't mark the date intentionally. I only noticed when it passed without significance. That realization made me smile. The story no longer needed an anniversary. It had ended when it stopped defining my days. Justice, I learned, isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet permission to move forward without carrying what was never yours to hold. And in that quiet, I finally understood something my younger self never could. Standing still for years had not been patience. Choosing to step forward now was. The real consequences didn't arrive all at once. They unfolded in layers, some visible, some private, some that took time to recognize as consequences at all. Rachel's life changed in ways the court never addressed directly. I learned about it gradually through fragments, conversations that stopped mid-sentence, updates shared with hesitation. The careful tone people use when they don't know which version of the story is safe to repeat. She had moved again. Left the apartment she took after selling the house, changed jobs, distanced herself from relatives who once defended her loudly. It wasn't that she was being punished. It was that the structure she had built her authority on no longer existed. Without control, she didn't know where to stand. For a long time, I thought I should feel satisfaction in that. Some sense of balance restored by watching her struggle the way I once had. But that feeling never came. What I felt instead was something quieter and harder to name: finality. The chapter was closed not because someone suffered enough, but because there was nothing left to prove. The last official interaction between us came unexpectedly. Months after everything ended, I received an email from her. No subject line, no greeting. It was short. She wrote that she never meant to hurt me, that she believed she was doing what was necessary, that she had carried more responsibility than anyone understood. She didn't apologize. She didn't acknowledge the legal findings directly. She ended by saying she hoped we could eventually move forward. I stared at the message for a long time before closing it. I didn't reply. Not out of anger, not out of spite, because moving forward doesn't always mean moving together. I had spent too many years translating silence into forgiveness, endurance into obligation. I wasn't willing to do that again. Some relationships don't require confrontation to end. They end when the truth has been fully exposed and nothing meaningful can grow in its shadow. I archived the email and went on with my day. Around that time, something else happened, something small but symbolic. I received the final distribution statement from the administrator. Everything had been accounted for, every dollar traced, every adjustment documented. There were no loose ends left to tie. I printed the statement, read it once, and filed it away. That document represented years of restraint, months of uncertainty, and a lifetime of learning how to stand still without disappearing. And I didn't need to look at it again. I noticed changes in myself that felt permanent. I spoke differently in meetings, more directly, less apologetically. I didn't soften statements that didn't need softening. I didn't rush to explain myself when clarity was enough. People responded to that. Not always positively, but honestly. I stopped confusing discomfort with wrongdoing. I stopped assuming that if someone was unhappy, I must have caused it. Those instincts had been shaped by a lifetime of adjusting to others' expectations. They no longer fit. One afternoon, I ran into someone who had known my family for decades. They told me they were surprised by how everything turned out, that they had always assumed Rachel would handle things better. I listened, then said simply, "I think everyone handled things the only way they knew how." That answer felt true. Rachel had acted out of control because control was the language she trusted. I had acted out of silence because silence had once kept me safe. Neither of us was born into those roles. We learned them, but only one of us had chosen to unlearn them. As the year came to a close, I found myself thinking less about what I had endured and more about what I had reclaimed. Not money, not property, agency. The ability to decide what mattered without waiting for permission. The ability to say no without explaining why. The ability to recognize when something felt wrong and to trust that feeling enough to act. Those were things no inheritance could buy. I no longer avoided family events out of fear of awkwardness. I attended when I wanted to. I declined when I didn't. I didn't perform reconciliation for the comfort of others. I let things be what they were. That too was a form of justice. One evening, as I was sorting through old boxes, I found a photo of my parents and me from years earlier. We were standing in front of the house, arms around each other, unremarkable and ordinary. I studied it for a long time. They looked happy, not strategic, not calculating, just present. I realized then that whatever mistakes had been made in the final years of their lives, they didn't erase everything that came before. I didn't need to rewrite the past to justify the present. I placed the photo in a frame and set it on my desk, not as a reminder of loss, but as proof that my story didn't begin or end with being overlooked. The court had restored balance in measurable ways, but the deeper correction had happened quietly internally when I stopped waiting to be acknowledged and chose instead to stand where I was fully visible. Justice had done its work. Now it was my turn to live without carrying the weight of it. The last thing the court returned to me wasn't money or property. It was time. Not the kind measured in hearings and deadlines, but the kind that opens up when you're no longer bracing yourself for the next blow. When there's no email to dread, no document to decode, no silence to interpret. Time that belongs to you again. It took me a while to trust that kind of time. For months after everything ended, I kept expecting something else to surface. Another claim, another accusation, another quiet attempt to rewrite what had already been settled. But nothing came. The systems had done what they were designed to do. The record was closed, and slowly I stopped checking over my shoulder. I made a decision I had postponed for years. I took a leave from work and traveled alone. Not to escape, but to listen to myself without interruption. I drove long stretches of road, stayed in places where no one knew my last name, woke up without an agenda. In that quiet, I realized how much of my life had been shaped by reaction, responding to expectations, adapting to dynamics I didn't choose. Measuring myself against a sister who always seemed to occupy the center of the room. Without that comparison, I felt strangely unanchored. And then steady. I thought often about the moment everything shifted. The attorney, pausing the question that stopped the room. How simple it was. How precise. How it didn't attack. My sister didn't defend me, didn't dramatize anything. It just asked for clarity. That question didn't change the truth. It revealed it. I understood then that justice hadn't arrived because someone finally spoke loudly enough. It arrived because the right question met a structure that couldn't ignore it. That mattered. Because for most of my life I believed that if I could just explain myself better, prove myself more clearly, endure a little longer, things would eventually balance out on their own. They didn't. Balance came when silence stopped being a strategy and became a boundary. I returned home with that understanding settled firmly in me. I reorganized my life with intention, what to keep, what to release, what no longer deserved my energy. That included people, habits, and narratives I had carried far past their usefulness. I didn't announce these changes. I didn't justify them. I just lived them. There was one final administrative step months later, a brief public filing confirming that all redistributions had been completed and no further claims were pending. It was routine, barely noticed by anyone else. I attended anyway. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to see the end where it actually ended. In a room that wasn't emotional, that wasn't charged, that didn't revolve around family roles or history, just facts, resolution, closure. Rachel wasn't there. I didn't feel her absence as a loss. I felt it as confirmation that we were no longer orbiting the same center. When the clerk stamped the final document, it sounded ordinary, dull, unremarkable. That sound meant more to me than any apology could have. Outside, the day went on as if nothing significant had happened. People passed by without knowing what had just closed in my life. Traffic moved. Phones rang. Someone laughed nearby. And I realized that this was the truest form of resolution. When your ending doesn't need witnesses. I walked away from the building without looking back. Not because I was trying to prove something, but because there was nothing left inside that belonged to me. Later that night, I wrote down what I had learned, not as a list of grievances, but as a record of growth. I wrote about the cost of staying quiet when clarity is required, about how easily responsibility can be mistaken for entitlement, about how the law at its best doesn't pick sides, it restores order. And I wrote about myself, about the version of me who thought endurance was the same as dignity, who believed that being overlooked was safer than being seen, who didn't realize that silence when overused teaches others how to treat you. I didn't write with bitterness. I wrote with precision, because precision had changed everything. I don't know what Rachel tells herself now. I don't know how she explains the outcome or where she places the blame. That story isn't mine anymore. What is mine is the certainty that I didn't win by taking something from her. I won by refusing to disappear, by letting the truth exist without wrapping it in emotion or apology, by trusting systems instead of stories, by standing still long enough for the right question to be asked. And when it was, I didn't need to answer. The truth already had. There's one lesson this story taught me that I wish someone had told me much earlier in life, and it's this: silence can protect you, but only until it starts protecting the wrong people. Many of us grow up believing that endurance is strength, that staying quiet makes us mature, that avoiding conflict makes us kind. And sometimes, in the right moments, that's true. But when silence becomes a habit, when it replaces clarity, boundaries, and truth, it slowly teaches the world that your absence is acceptable. Justice doesn't always come from fighting harder or speaking louder. Often it comes from recognizing the exact moment when silence stops serving you and choosing to stand still instead of stepping aside. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with enough self-respect to let the truth exist even when it's uncomfortable. If you're listening to this and you've ever felt overlooked, minimized, or quietly pushed out of a place you once belonged, I want you to know, this being patient does not mean being invisible. You are allowed to ask questions. You are allowed to seek clarity. And you are allowed to take up space in your own story. I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening from? And what part of this story stayed with you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters here. And if stories about quiet strength, delayed justice, and finding dignity without shouting resonate with you, consider subscribing to the channel. You're not just watching a story, you're part of a community that believes even the most overlooked voices deserve to be heard.